So, how likely are new institutions to provide the answer to global dilemmas? And now we're talking about institutions that are established with a strong focus on formalization, transparency, representation, regulation, and rights, these types of things. And so these types of institutions can operate at all levels in a polycentric type sense. Now, new institutionalists are quite optimistic about the prospects for transforming weak institutions into robust ones. And these robust institutions can be brought about through an active process of institutional design and crafting. And Ostrom sees this sort of institution crafting as a continuous evolutionary process. And remember, bringing back in these contextual features, where these contextual features become part of a sort of institutional resource bank from which arrangements can be drawn. These arrangements being the distributional norms and relations of trust that we've been talking about. So here, the contextual features can be consciously used to strengthen institutions. But what if we sort of reconsider these contextual features, not just as objective context, but as constructed, and constructed by existing institutions, ideology, and/or existing political relationships? Can they still be consciously used to strengthen institutions? Well, this raises the question of the critical role of agency in shaping and reshaping institutions. To what extent are actors institutional engineers? To what extent does this causal arrow run in one direction? So some more, and what I would call old school political economists, would argue that rarely are institutions really the result of individual rational choice, but they are constructed through what Mary Douglas would call a process of bricolage. And that is gathering and applying norms and rules that are already part of existing institutions. And I have quite a nice quote from Mary Douglas's book, How Institutions Think. And she writes here that the bricoleur uses everything there is to make transformations within a stock repertoire of furnishings. And I just like that quote, so I wanted to share it with you. But again, this speaks back to Lawson in week 1, where we understand the structure to be differentiated and changing, so it isn't static. But while the structure is a necessary condition and always pre-exists any instant of agency, individual agency here is going to be necessary for the reproduction and transformation of the structure. And so what we have here is collective action is characterized both by agency and structural constraint. And these structural constraints might pre-shape how actors respond to collective global dilemmas. So the evolution of collective decision-making institutions may not really be the process of a kind of conscious selection of mechanisms fit for the collective action task, as in Armstrong's model, but rather it reflects a messier process of piecing together by actors acting within the bounds of circumstantial constraint. And this is what bricolage really means, where institutions are formed through more ad hoc type processes, and they are embedded in complex networks of existing norms and practices. And just to go back for a moment to this idea that actors' responses to global dilemmas are pre-shaped, we can think of them as being pre-shaped by deeply embedded understandings about, a desirable way of organising life, practices in relation to those resources, to things that are going on in the world, and of course to aspirations. And all of these things are heavily loaded with kind of a political economic ideology. And this is really what anchors new institutional and political arrangements. And so different bricoleurs, so to speak, or different actors are likely to apply their knowledge, power and agency in respect to collective action in different ways. And some bricoleurs are likely to possess more power resources than others. And we can think of these power resources not just in economic wealth terms, but also in terms of having specialist knowledge, or even sort of less tangible things like strength or honesty. So we can think about the ways that we stereotype certain countries in international negotiations, and think about how we stereotype the Nordic countries. But multiple sources of authority mean That negotiation around who has the right to mediate the norms, form and interpret the rules, and definitely enforce sanctions, well, all of this is going to be, negotiation around these points is inevitable. And so the result here is that often existing patterns of inequality are reproduced in any form of negotiation. And this is pretty much what we see in negotiations regarding global dilemmas at all levels. So where does this leave us in practical terms? Well, part of the exercise in understanding institutional formation and reform and transformation has to be uncovering the sort of deeply embedded principles which shape decision making. So when we identify those, we might be able to identify the scope for flexibility in negotiating the norms and practices, and this applies again at all different levels. So this seems to be so obvious, yet at the same time so slippery. But what it might be is just the key to responding to global dilemmas.